And Sally, I think you need to give me the ability to share my screen.
Sue will do that.
Okay.
First, I'm going to say some nice things about what you
It shouldn't
bring
take long.
bring to us. Um, I echo Sue in saying, Willie, very much appreciate your being here tonight, and look forward to hearing about the cumulative impacts legislation. Willie is an environmental justice advocate living in Wilmington with his wife of 52 years, right?
52, 53, but we're not counting.
He is the executive committee vice chair of the Delaware Sierra Club chapter. He established and currently chairs the chapter's environmental justice committee. He's also a member of the Delaware Environmental Accountability Coalition, which is a statewide group of environmental justice community residents and environmental organizations currently working to develop and implement legislation to reduce the cumulative impacts of environmental permitting in Delaware. He hails from Virginia and had a 45-year career in chemical and synthetic fibers industry. He, prior to retiring as senior vice president of global operations, he was responsible for manufacturing facilities all over the world. And his core philosophy, as he was managing 16,000 people, is something I wish would be universal. I love it, and I wish it would be universal. If we can't operate without harming people, then we can't operate. Since retirement, Willie's used this experience and perspectives from the business sector to push for correcting many of the environmental injustices in Delaware, focusing on action to create meaningful change. And that direct exposure to environmental policies and regulations in various countries has given him a broad context for how industries can operate in a safer, environmentally responsible and ethical manner. Willie, thank you again. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Sally, for the introduction, and that it continues to remind me of the opportunities we have in front of us and the breadth of the work, I guess, that we have ahead of us. So I appreciate that. Let's see if I can get this in the right place. Is that working for everyone? Okay. So again, thanks for the opportunity to discuss what I think is a very important topic, especially for EJ communities, but in essence, for all communities across the state of Delaware. You know, I often have to remind myself that given that we're such a small and compact state, the effects of concentrated sources of pollution have the greatest impact on the people that live nearby. But we're all affected at some level or another. So tonight, I'd like to discuss the subject of cumulative impacts, and specifically try to put more definition around the term. What do we mean by cumulative impacts in this context? Highlight some of the effects of cumulative impacts from exposure to pollution across the state might have, and it looks different in different parts of the state. Discuss a little bit about how we could do a better job of managing going forward. And provide an overview of a legislative effort designed to accomplish that end. And naturally, we'll try to leave some time for Q&A and discussion, and hopefully some feedback on some of the things we talk about. So we'll start off with the interactive part first. So this is an opportunity for you, right? So how would you define cumulative impacts? Given that, you know, there are probably lots of definitions floating around out there, and everybody may have a different view of what that looks like. So just a little bit of feedback from the group on how you think about cumulative impacts and what you think that might mean.
For me, it has to do with the piling on of environmental injustice on communities, particularly underserved communities.
That's great. I think you're pretty close to it there. Any other thoughts? Well, maybe we'll just go ahead.
Roger has a thought.
Well, I know that permits, when you look at a company that wants to do a business, and they say, well, what's coming out of our smokestacks is this and this and this, and then it's managed. How is that managed? How do you say that permit is good or bad? And what are you measuring when you decide that? And if you're not measuring all of the cumulative impacts, including those from non-point sources like automobiles, traffic and whatnot, you're going to disadvantage and provide real problems for some people.
Roger, I think I'll turn
And-
the rest of this discussion over to you. And that's pretty much on target. Other thoughts?
I would just add one more thought that to me it represents a shift in thinking from looking at each individual application for a permit to looking at the applications and the impacts in context, so that it's just, if one might be kind of a marginal impact, when you add it on to everything else, it might be really bad.
It's right on target. Right on target. Any other thoughts?
I think when we look at history, there are actions that have been taken building the interstates or locating landfills or distributing toxic materials. And there's a tendency to assume that there are these undesirable locations to occupy, but desirable to make the locus of toxic materials or other industries. And those consequences just pile on top of one another and make a place almost uninhabitable because we think of it as being inconsequential, the people who are there or the location, if we go back in history.
Yeah, no, that's right on target, Sue. I think, like you said, this isn't a recent phenomenon that we're dealing with here. It's an accumulation of activities over, many, many years. And you can go back, I guess, in more recent history to the concept of redlining. And, where do we allow certain people to live? And then what do we do, around those people, or what's been done in that area before those people got there? And then, what's been done afterwards. So we create this situation that we've got, and you can see it fairly clearly in Newcastle, but also down in Sussex, where we've got people living across the street from large industrial chemical plants. And as we look at bringing in more businesses, and we think about economic development for the state, the new stuff tends to land in the same place. So again, we just keep, building and building on this plethora of sources of pollution that we've got in the state. But it's typically concentrated around certain groups of people, typically underprivileged and less resource communities. So there's been a lot of discussion around this whole concept of looking at the cumulative health and environmental impacts of some of these decisions that we've made over the years. And the definitions of cumulative impacts, I think, it's kind of evolved. The EPA and various environmental justice advocates, have really raised the significance of this issue over the last few years. And so, here's the EPA's latest definition. I think they put this together late last year, maybe mid last year. And again, I think the words will continue to evolve. But I think what's critical is, while we look at the exposure of both chemical and non-chemical stresses, like socioeconomic factors, and recognize that those can combine to create cumulative health impacts. When viewed in its entirety, the topic quickly becomes a proverbial elephant, which has to be eaten, one bite at a time. When you think about particularly some of the socioeconomic issues, how do you come up with solutions that address, that layer of issues, as well as the chemical stressor type issues. And so looking at this whole thing of cumulative impacts of all of those things and trying to come up with a couple of silver bullets to correct it is kind of insurmountable. So we've kind of taken the approach of, well, let's break this thing down and deal with one aspect and think about, how we can really affect the change in that one aspect. And so that's where our focus is on the chemical stressor side, more so than trying to look at socioeconomic factors and other social determinants of health outcomes. So that's kind of what we'll talk about a bit tonight is, to keep things in that context. and specifically how, to the point I think that was made earlier, how the state and its environmental regulatory process, and particularly the permitting process, could be modified to reduce the disproportionate levels of pollution in certain communities. So, again, I think we've kind of hit on this already, but here's kind of a cartoon to simplify the concept of cumulative impacts relative to how applications for environmental permits are handled in Delaware. So many residential areas across the state coexist, as I mentioned earlier, with various polluting industries. But when DNREC looks to a permit, or looks at an application for a permit for a new or an existing facility that wants to expand, they only consider the pollution from that particular facility and assess that level of emissions against, the federal standards and state criteria. But in reality, we also have significant levels of pollution that may already exist from a variety of sources, like heavy industry, industrial farming, motor vehicular traffic, landfills, and so on. And these sources can pollute the air, water, and the soil surrounding residential communities. So the proposed new source of pollution should be considered as an addition to the pollution that already exists. And the effects of that total level of pollution should be assessed based on residents' exposure over time. So it's the cumulative total of all of the pollution that existed in an area, whether it be from point or non-point sources or vehicular traffic, as an example. Brownfields that may still contain contaminants that are either leaching into the water supply or sometimes leaching into the air. But all of those sources need to be considered and added together and considered over time. Then we start to really understand what cumulative impacts means and how it affects people and how our permitting process may be better than what we have today. So how could we do a better job of managing? And given that understanding, how do you think we could do a better job? And I think we've kind of touched on that a little bit already. But one thing to keep in mind is that the decision on where to locate or build a facility is a zoning issue, right? And that's managed by the county, the city, or the local municipality. That's where that authority lies. But the permission to operate the facility is controlled by DNREC through its approval of an environmental permit. So we have to kind of bifurcate those two things in our mind. Often we'll get into the issue of, well, why are you building it here? Well, the zoning says I can build it here. So the next step in that process is if the zoning is okay, then you have to go get an environmental permit to operate. And at that stage, DNREC doesn't have any say other than whether or not the emissions that you propose to release from this project fit within, federal guidelines or within state guidelines, and approve or reject a permit on that basis. And typically, DNREC does not have the basis, I should say, almost said authority, but they don't have the basis for that rejection unless it's really a gross misalignment with those criteria. And typically at that point, they will come back with some recommendations on or conditions on, well, we'll approve your permit if you do these things. Then typically they move forward. So that's kind of where we are today. And the idea is that we think we can do some things differently. And that's what this legislation that we worked on for the past 3 years kind of comes into play. So keeping some of those issues in mind, I'll kind of walk through an overview of some of the work in progress that's been designed to reduce cumulative impacts created by our environmental permitting process. So back in 2018, New Jersey passed a cumulative impacts legislation, and I think they completed the regulatory process. All the regulations around that bill have been defined now, and the process is actually in place and running. But when we saw that, I think back in late 2018, early 2019, a group of us looked at it and thought, that's kind of what we need here. So we began work to build a piece of legislation for Delaware modeled after what was done in New Jersey. The differences being that the New Jersey bill was primarily focused on power generation and incineration facilities that were located in overburdened communities. And you know, while we didn't have those particular issues, we did have issues in the state that were unique to us and also unique by county. So if you think about, you know, Newcastle County in particular, you know, the issues we have to deal with are typically heavy industry related, some warehousing and distribution, which is now a growing trend in the state. If you move down to Sussex County, it's poultry farming, and all the issues that come from that, you know, whether it be the raising of, you know, poultry or the processing and slaughtering and disposing of waste from the poultry process, poultry farming process and poultry slaughtering process. The middle part of the county, you know, around Dover Air Force Base, we've had the issues with PFAS contamination and groundwater. And so, you know, those are the kinds of things that we have to think about, you know, as we look at how we can do a better job of managing the proliferation of toxics in these various communities. So this group that Sally mentioned earlier, the Delaware Environmental Accountability Coalition, is basically a collection of community members, community leaders, environmental groups, and environmental justice organizations across the state that, you know, kind of banded together to think about, you know, how we could do a better job in the state, considering all of the concerns we had and the variety of concerns we had. And that was kind of the genesis of what was originally submitted as House Bill 466 back in 2021. And we took a shot at it early on, thinking we could get the bill done quickly. And in contrast, New Jersey took 7 years to develop and implement the legislation they passed back in 2018. But we thought we could do better, right? And that didn't turn out that way. So the bill was filed late in 2020. We kind of took a year off to look at how we could improve the content of the bill and to do a better job of communicating with affected communities across the state. We actually spent some time working with DNREC to get their input and thoughts around, you know, how we could make this a better bill. I won't talk about that much more, but anyhow, we got support from Representative Kendra Johnson, so she's the prime sponsor for the bill. Representative Larry Lambert is a co-sponsor, but we've also picked up co-sponsors from both chambers of the legislature. And the bill is also supported by the Delaware Black Caucus, Legislative Black Caucus, I should say. So, you know, we're at a stage now where we're continuing to work on refinement. And our intent is to have that bill reintroduced in the current session, hopefully by mid-February. So we'll move forward with that. It'll have a new name. It won't be HB 466, since it'll have to be reintroduced, but, you know, we'll communicate the new name once that's done. So here's kind of a high-level overview of the bill's key features and how they compare to DNREC's current practices. So in this proposal, overburdened communities are required to be identified based on proximity to sources of pollution and ethnic and economic demographics. The types of facilities that emit significant levels of toxic emissions are identified. And if those facilities are applying for a permit and they exist in an overburdened community, they have to undergo greater scrutiny in that permitting process. DNREC would be required to assess the cumulative impact of the proposed project and not just the standalone emissions from that proposal. And there will be significant changes in the area of communications and outreach. And those will be required with things like mandatory public hearings. Today, if a permit application comes through, DNREC will advertise the permit application, but they won't necessarily require a public hearing unless it's requested. So in a lot of cases, these permit applications kind of slide under the radar. People aren't paying attention. They don't see them. They only become aware of a proposal once the permit's already been, you know, approved and things are moving forward. So one change we put in this bill is that those hearings aren't optional, they're mandatory. if the permit application is for a facility that's going to be in an overburdened community. That would be the establishment of an environmental justice board, and 2/3 of the membership of that board would be from overburdened communities. And that board would be responsible for oversight of the permitting process, making recommendations to DENREC on permit applications. And there's some other administrative functions in there, like including ensuring that the communities that have been identified, that list is complete, whether or not it needs to be updated on some frequency, or if there are new types of facilities that come into play that weren't originally considered in the bill, that those are brought forward in terms of consideration for greater oversight. There's another phenomena that occurs in the state where permit applicants are allowed to use credits that they can purchase in the market to offset any new emissions coming from this proposal or their proposed new facility. And this particular bill would disallow the use of those credits in overburdened communities. So when you think about it, Roger and I decided we're going to build a plant in some part of the state. And we're going to emit so much stuff that we can't offset all of it. We can't mitigate all of it. We'll put in scrubbers and we'll put in, pollution control devices and all those happy things. But we just can't get rid of it to a level that meets the state criteria or the federal criteria. So we can go out on the market for a few $1,000s and buy credits that were generated when other facilities reduce their emissions. And therefore, those are used as an offset. Those credits are used as an offset. Sounds good on the surface, but the net effect of that for the community that's affected is that Roger and I are still going to emit more emissions than we should, okay? And those offsets that we bought may have been from emissions reductions anywhere in the state, not necessarily in that community or in that neighborhood or even in the city, right? So that's a practice that we feel is kind of out of date and ineffective and wrong. And so we're saying we want to disallow that. And then most importantly, DENREC would have the authority in this case to reject the permit request for a new facility or the expansion of an existing facility. And that's a bit different than what it is today. And that would be premised on, number one, the findings that come out of what we call an environmental justice impact report that would do a complete assessment of, as we mentioned, the existing level of pollution in the community, in addition to the new level of pollution that's being proposed. And if that kind of puts us in a tilt situation where we say, the professionals say that this puts the community in an unhealthy position, then that would be a basis for DENREC being able to say, we're not going to approve this permit. So that's a little different than the level of authority DENREC has today. So just kind of a simplified view of how the permit approval process would work. Kind of talk through this a little bit, but just to kind of illustrate it. So again, we've got a facility up here, and those facilities are defined in the bill. And one thing here around facilities, there's actually a listing. I won't go through all of those unless somebody wishes to see them. But they're typically the types of facilities that are most egregious in terms of their ability to pollute. So we're not talking about the local service station or convenience store or the dry cleaners. There's a whole different set of rules that deal with dry cleaners and what solvents they can use. But so not the mom and pop shops, right? So we're not trying to push small businesses out of business. But we are looking at large businesses and large industries and saying, again, okay, there's certain things that you need to do if you want to come into these communities. And the whole intent here is that you can't come in and continue to expose people to unacceptable levels or disproportionate levels of pollution. So two key criteria here to start this process or to be engaged in it. So you have to be one of those facilities as defined in the bill. You're looking for an environmental permit, and you're looking to do that work or start that project in an overburdened community. And again, those overburdened communities would be defined and mapped so that everyone's aware of which communities we're talking about. So if those two things take place, then the applicant has to submit an environmental justice impact report. And that impact report will be done by a third party, not by the applicant. The applicant would have to pay for it, but it will be done by a reputable third party professional organization, and there's several of those around the country. In fact, there's one that has an office here in Newark that, you know, they're experienced with performing these kinds of analyses. So that report would look at, you might expect, you know, at current exposure levels from all sources for that particular geographic area or community, and overlay that with, you know, the new proposal and make an assessment based on scientific data and fact of whether or not this proposal is acceptable or whether it places the community at an extensive level of harm. And that would be a key basis for, you know, how this decision is being made going forward. That environmental justice impact report would be reviewed by a community or public hearing. I call it a community meeting here, or community hearing, but a public hearing. And in that public hearing, the one thing that fundamentally changes from what's being done today is DNREC has two formats, or the two forums, I should say, for communicating and informing the public. One is a community meeting. And the thing about a community meeting is, number one, it's not part of the public record, but it is a forum where the applicant, DNREC, and the affected residents or the public can have dialogue. So it's a two-way, three-way, four-way kind of discussion so that people can get information and establish some understanding and ask questions and get those questions answered. The second forum is what's called a public hearing. It's a more formal process. It is part of the public record, but it's basically a presentation from DNREC, a presentation from the applicant, and an opportunity for the public to testify whether or not they support or don't support the project. So two different forums. So we're looking at a means to blend these two. We want this discussion to be part of the public record, so there's recourse later on if necessary. We want there to be dialogue and, you know, questions asked and answers given. And, you know, whether or not there need to be two processes, you know, a community hearing and a public hearing, that's yet to be decided. But we do want to make sure that there's good dialogue around what's being proposed and the output of that environmental justice impact report. So at any rate, once that's accomplished, and again, that community hearing would be required or mandatory, but once that's accomplished, the output of that discussion and the environmental impact report, or I should say environmental justice impact report, would move on to the Environmental Justice Board, which would have been part of that community meeting, by the way, and DNREC. And all of those inputs, the details around the application, the output or the discussion from the community hearing, the output from the environmental justice report, all of those factors would go into play now for DNREC and the Environmental Justice Board. That Environmental Justice Board would make their own recommendation to DNREC as to whether or not that permit should be approved. And it's a recommendation. That board would have no legal jurisdiction over making a decision, but it would be key input to DNREC in addition to the other inputs. And then DNREC would make a final decision. And so that final decision can take one of two tracks. So if the application is for a new or expanding facility, DNREC would have the option of rejecting the application, applying conditions to the application. In other words, we'll approve it, but you have to do A, B, C, and D, or just flat out approving it without conditions. If it's for the renewal of an existing facility, so this is a facility that's been in operation and on some frequency, typically 5 to 10 years, they have to renew their permits. Then in those cases, DNREC really has two routes. One, to apply conditions. In other words, you know, we kind of looked at your emissions over time. You fit all of the guidelines that we established when we originally gave you the permit or at the last review of your permit. But in an effort to, you know, make you a better citizen and reduce the pollution in the community, we do want to apply conditions. Or they could just say, you know, fine, it's approved, and then move forward. So that's kind of the high-level view of what the process would look like, and then how that decision making, how those decisions will be made. The other thing is that if a decision from DNREC is different from what came from the Environmental Justice Board, then in the Secretary's publication of that decision, he would also have to explain why he or she, depending on who it is, made a different decision than what was recommended by the board. So again, that will be part of the public record, and you know, again, an avenue for recourse down the road if one was chosen. So next steps. We're in the process, DEAC, I should say, or the Delaware Environmental Accountability Coalition, is in the process of wrapping up our outreach and communications efforts to inform communities and various organizations about the bill and to gain additional feedback. And hopefully we'll get some feedback from you tonight as well. We'll then make the final changes to the details of the bill, and the target is to reintroduce it in mid-February. And I hope I'm not too optimistic this time. And then once the bill's filed, I should say, then we'll start work on advocacy. And that would include, letter writing, opinion pieces, letters to the editor, media engagement, and naturally the best part of the whole process is filling up Leg Hall anytime there are hearings or votes on the bill. So that's kind of what we've got in front of us. So I've talked long enough. Any thoughts, comments, questions?
Willie, thank you. That was a really clear presentation of this potential legislature, this hoped for legislation. I guess one question I have is, what do you anticipate your support level to be in the General Assembly?
That's a great question. As indicated, we've got support from the Legislative Black Caucus. So that's a fairly formidable body. We think most of the, trying not to be partisan here, but I think most of the Democratic caucus will support us, the majority. I think most of the pushback will come from those that are aligned with industry and business, and probably the southern part of the state. So I think we have a majority of the legislature that will support this bill. And one key ringer in this whole thing is DNREC. How will DNREC position itself and the governor naturally in terms of support or opposition? So that's kind of a wild card right now for us.
Roger?
Willie, if you would stop sharing your screen, then we can
Sure.
see the whole group.
Yep.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I guess Willie and I are trying to build a plant, which was quite interesting. But let's talk about, I've got an existing plant.
Okay.
And I didn't have to go through this process 10 years ago when I started it up, or 30 years ago when I started it up. But in the meantime, the area has grown up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and there's more traffic, and there's a plant that next door that's putting out some stuff. And it was fine before,
Right.
and I've been here for 30 years.
Yeah.
And now I have to get a new permit to operate. And what do you say to me? You're going to say, well, this community is overburdened. And I say, I can't do anything about that. I mean, nothing's changed in my process. What do I do? And do I get a permit to continue operation, or how does that work?
Yeah. So if you and I already own a plant and we're just going through the motions of getting our permit renewed, because those things expire again on some frequency. Then again, there are two things that can happen to us. One would be DNREC says, okay, we've looked at everything. We looked at your performance over the past 5 years or whatever in terms of non-compliance and that kind of stuff. No issues. Roger and Willie, your new permits or your permit's been renewed. Okay. The other one might be that, in the scenario you described where, oh, gee, we got here 30 years ago. Crota built a plant since then, Fuji built a plant since then, and all of these other plants are around, and the interstate's tripled in size, and traffic through the area is, quadrupled. Not things that we did, but the reality is that we're sitting in an environment where people are overburdened with pollution. And so Roger and Willie will approve your permit, but we need you to put some level of abatement on some of your emissions. Okay. And typically those are going to be things that aren't, they're not inexpensive, okay, but they're not prohibitively expensive. So again, in the context of being a good corporate citizen, and operating in an ethical manner, you and I will probably find a way to come up with the cash or borrow the money to put a scrubber in, right? And you know, do our part to curb the emissions in our community because, you know, we profit from being there. So let's, you know, take care of our investment.
And I saw something last week by David Stevenson of the Cesar Rodney Institute about
My friend, yeah.
my friend too, about, particulate matter,
Right.
PM 2.5, which I guess is 2.5 micron. And
Yeah, that's right.
and we are in a non-attainment zone according to EPA. Is it much of the state, some of the state?
Newcastle County for ozone
Ozone.
levels, right? Just in Newcastle County for ozone. Now the state, Newcastle County had been non-attainment for all three criteria up until last year. Year before last, I think we actually started making improvements. So
Yeah.
just one criteria now.
Okay. Well, Mr. Stevenson talked about, 84% of the PM 2.5 is things we can't control. And so I went to another source and I said, what is PM 2.5 from? And it said coal-fired power plants, power generation, and automobiles. And it's like, okay, no. So I would submit that Mr. Stevenson is certainly going to be in opposition to this.
Oh, yeah.
And he's quite vocal, and he usually gets his op-eds in the News Journal. And I haven't seen a letter to the editor in the News Journal in some time. I don't know what's happened.
Well, there'll be a response. A response to Mr. Stevens' letter is forthcoming.
Okay, great.
And you know, so well, I won't make it personal. So people tend to, one tendency is to make statements that are almost true, and then pontificate on that, right? So yeah, there are lots of sources of PM 2.5 in the state. The predominant sources from traffic, mobile traffic, particularly from diesel traffic. Diesel trucks emit huge amounts of PM 2.5. But it depends on where you're looking. So if you live across the street from, or you live near Diamond Materials, where concrete is ground then recycled, one of the most deadly forms of PM, or particulate matter, whether it be PM 10 or PM 2.5, is from silica. And so when you grind concrete, the dust that comes up is basically silica dust. Silica dust is almost like PFAS. Once you get it in your lungs, it doesn't come out. And it just, creates all kinds of respiratory issues and cancer. If you're down in southern Delaware, near one of the poultry processing plants, where they're dealing with the waste, particularly feathers and that kind of stuff that come from, chicken processing, you're exposed to a different kind of particulate matter. In this case, the fibrous stuff that gets blown up into the air, which could be feathers primarily and bone matter, and that gets lodged in your lungs. So Mr. Stevens is somewhat, I won't say he's misinformed, but he's misrepresenting reality and making gross misstatements about, our exposure to 2.5. The one issue that, we've been pushing at the Sierra Club is a lot of the data that DENREC uses and reports to the federal government, to the EPA, is from monitors that they have set up across the state. And so those monitoring stations, I think there are 11 of them, if I'm correct. For Wilmington, there's one near Interstate 95. Trying to think of the precise name of the street, but there's one location for Wilmington. And what's monitored at that particular station are things like 2.5 PM, all levels of PM, 2.5 and 10, some toxics, some air toxics, and what else? And ozone, I think. So it's not the full menu of things that are in the air in those environments. The other thing is that monitoring station is nowhere near where a lot of our heavy industry is located in Newcastle County. So those air toxins aren't captured in that monitoring. Similarly, if you go downstate, the monitors are not located near the interstate, and you look at the amount of beach traffic we got now going through the middle part of the state, and how that's expanded over time. So we're not catching the emissions from vehicular traffic or, like you said, non-point emissions. And then likewise, if you get out, into the southern part of the state, there are no monitoring stations around Mountain Air or Purdue or any of the other poultry processing plants. So the data that we send to EPA, in my mind, is grossly incomplete and an inaccurate reflection of what people are actually exposed to in the state. So when you take that incomplete database and then lay it on top of thoughts and beliefs around pollution and the effects it has on people, it gets to be a difficult conversation for people like Mr. Stevens.
Thank you.
Sigh. Maura?
Thanks. Willie, it's always lovely to hear your voice. It's so beautiful. Two real discrete questions. The first one you might have answered and I missed it. And both of them relate to the new legislation. Do you need a majority vote?
Yes.
Simple majority is enough?
Simple majority, yeah.
Okay. And I assume since the bill hasn't been introduced yet, you don't have any, it's too early to have any sense of the financial impact.
No, I'm sure there'll be a
Fiscal note.
Yeah, fiscal note attached. I'm sure DNREC will stand up and say they need 3,000 people to administer this and billions of dollars to do it. So that will be one challenge as well, is that there will probably be a fiscal note attached.
Yeah, government agencies don't usually complain about getting bigger, but we'll, I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Other thoughts, comments, feedback?
Well, if a new facility applies for a permit and the Environmental Justice Board finds that it would be beneficial to the community, but that it's because of the level of existing emissions or pollution or whatever, it would push things over the line for the community. Can conditions be imposed on existing uses outside of the renewal process, like midterm?
Not through this particular legislation. I think it would take, additional work to create something like that. And that's an interesting topic. One of the clauses in the Jersey bill was similar to what you just described, that one criteria that the environmental department would consider was whether or not it would be a benefit to the community. And that could override, some of the other issues. But the concern we had there was, well, who decides what's beneficial to the community, and how do you quantify that? And then how do you weigh it against the risk to life? Right? I mean, it's what we're talking about.
Right.
So it's kind of a knotty situation. So we consciously chose to stay away from that, as a component. But it is an issue, I think, that, may need to be considered at some level. And that's why we were very careful to say, hey, we're not looking at things that could, in fact, be beneficial to the community. Like I said, if somebody wanted to open up a Wawa in the community, then you could very easily see that that's meeting a need, right, that people in the community have. So it's an issue, I think, that, we probably need to continue to think about on a larger scale, for those larger scale kind of projects. But we consciously left it out of this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sandy?
Yes, I had a question related to the monitoring that you were mentioning before. You were saying the monitoring station isn't near where some of the problems are. Could they have more monitoring stations so that they are near these communities that seem to be at the greatest disadvantage, or primarily having them near where most of the industry is, both in the north and in the south of Delaware, where they are different? Are those expensive to set up? It seems like having more of them and have them in more distinct places would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes, we could have more. And in fact, when we wrote the DENREC last year, we being Sierra Club in this case, um, it was during the time they were submitting their previous year's data to EPA for approval. Um, and, our contention then was that, with all of the money that was coming out of the infrastructure bill of states, a lot of that was targeted towards improving environmental conditions, which, would include monitoring or increased monitoring. So yeah, we should have more monitors in the state, more strategically located, based on the sources that we've got in the state. The monitors themselves, depending on the type, what it is that we're actually trying to monitor, they aren't, again, grossly expensive. I mean, $25,000 to $30,000 for most, general purpose monitors. But then there's the analysis that has to be done on some frequency, so you collect the samples, send them off for analysis, and, interpret the data and all of that good stuff and publish it. So it's not just, putting the monitor in, there's, support work and maintenance that goes along with that as well, which requires the resources, right?
But what would it take to make that happen, to actually install new monitors?
Most of these are on the shelf items. So it's not like somebody has to go out and invent and build them. You can buy them, have them installed. I'm not going to make a guess here, but I will guess and say if you said you wanted to buy one today, you could have it installed by mid-year.
Who makes those decisions?
DENREC. Yeah, DENREC does. Now, one thing that has happened is, again, coming from the Justice 40 funds, and I think some from the infrastructure funds, certain communities in the state have been awarded grants for what are called personal monitors. These are small monitors that you can put in your house or actually wear on your person, so as you move about, through the community, you're collecting data. And then that data gets assembled and, people can look at it and kind of analyze it and use that as a reference. The downside of that is the data has no legal standing, right? So it's information. So if you wanted to contest or challenge Bob and I on our new plant, it's not going to work for you. It's kind of informative, but not, anything that we can take to court. So it's good for information. I think it's good for educating communities in terms of what they're being exposed to, so that they're aware. And then, like I said, it's another piece of data. It's just not sound legal data. Mark?
I'm following up on Sandy's question about the monitors. This summer, when we were having all the problem with the smoke coming from the wildfires in Canada,
Right.
somehow I stumbled onto a website called Air Now
Mm-hmm.
that I loaded on my phone, and we looked at it all the time. And I found it was really helpful to me to understand what was going on. And I just pulled it up and looked at it, and are the monitors on that site the ones you're talking about? It looks like they're measuring PM 2.5, PM10, and ozone. Are those the monitors you're talking about?
Yeah, well, those monitors are the source of that data.
Okay.
But there's other data that comes out of those monitors too. So they monitor,
Okay.
like I said, for some toxic pollutants. Don't typically publish those. But if you go to the Department of Health website or the DENREC website, and gee, I was trying to remember the name of it. I wanted to say My Healthy Communities, but I think it is My Healthy Community. The source of that data is from those monitoring stations.
Okay, thanks.
Sheridan?
Yes, I wanted to ask, I was worried about those planes that are, moving over Delaware, going to Philadelphia. Is there an impact on all those planes and the gas and the exhaust coming from them? Because we are right in the line of fire.
Yeah, so the one thing that the regulatory agency, DENREC, I won't throw DENREC under the bus, but one thing that people rely on when they look at exposure to pollution, or things like the elevation of the pollution. So what's the concentration level at certain levels of elevation, wind direction, and other atmospheric conditions. So kind of a roundabout answer to your question. If you live near Newcastle Airport, where we're seeing expanded air traffic now, with some of the new flights coming out, then yeah, you're at a greater level of exposure than you were prior to those new flights, because a lot of that, the pollution from takeoffs and landings, are at ground level or slightly above ground level. Once you get up, a certain elevation, you'll rely on wind dispersion to move the pollution away, if it's air pollution we're talking about, and to dilute it, all right? So you're, blowing it in some direction with the wind, and you're, diluting it with clean air, the pollution with clean air. So the further it gets away from you, the lower the concentration. So if you're thinking about planes overhead, they're polluting the atmosphere. And, consequently, that has an impact on the environment and ozone, but they're not necessarily generating ground level pollution. Most of the ground level pollution from air traffic would be, around the airport, where there are takeoffs and landings.
Roger?
Oh, just a quick one about, you just talked about elevation. They speak about ground level ozone, but they don't say what level the monitoring stations are at that are picking this up. What is the height of the monitoring stations?
The main one downtown is probably 30 feet.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. Now they're able to do they're able to do modeling, based on the data that they get at, at certain locations and elevations and all that happy stuff to understand what the spread would look like, an area, or, up in the atmosphere. But I think that station is probably about 30 feet tall. It's down near the railroad station, the train station.
Well, it's, and you say a personal monitoring station has no weight of law, but if you had a personal monitoring station, so you get located at a particular place, it might have a good argument for saying, hey, you're not measuring the right thing here. So if somebody wanted to say, all right, look, I can't get DENREC to do it, but my community is going to buy one. My community is going to install it here, and because we have alarm bells here. We have people with emphysema and chronic obstruction of the pulmonaries and all that, and at least that would provide a argument to say, guys, you're missing the boat here.
Exactly. Yeah. No, they're perfect for raising an issue, spotlighting or pinpointing an issue. As it relates to different levels of pollution or different types of pollution. So I agree with you. They're absolutely perfect for that intent.
Yeah. And there's also concern that, you say socioeconomic situations really can't be addressed in this bill, but if you talk about the temperature increases in Delaware cities, black roofs and asphalt and concrete and lack of trees, then those conditions, interior homes, are a real multiplying factor. It's a real threat multiplier for that. And I know that there are probably plans to you could put monitors in homes and have them report automatically saying, this home is at 94 degrees and it has been, the lowest it got last night was 89. That's not livable.
Right.
Those sorts of things are possible too.
Yeah, and they fit with this discussion as well in terms of cumulative exposure to pollution, because if you're living in an environment like that, then you're probably more susceptible to health issues in general. And then those get exacerbated by the quality of air that you breathe. So, it all kind of ties together, and to your point.
Willie, this is an editorial comment, and it sort of piggybacks on Roger's, but I'm finding it distressing that these monitors are not where they need to be. And I guess, and what can we do about that?
What can we do about it? Right.
Keep telling DENREC we need more monitors. We need those monitors strategically located, so that we've got a full and true perspective of, pollution levels in the state.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Who's the person at DENREC to write to?
Sean Garvin, the secretary.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And, I think, so now editorialize a little bit, pontificate. So one of the things that we're really fighting against in all of these environmental efforts, not just EJ, the state's kind of in a catch-22, I think, or the state views itself as being in a catch-22. There are all of these legacy issues with, the environment, and I think most intelligent people recognize those. But then there's this issue too of how do we create economic growth in the state? And so, if you kind of look at our history over the past 20 years or so, with DuPont's demise and NBNA coming in and blowing out, and the Chrysler plant folding, and the GM plant folding, and everything else that folded, and all of the money the government's got to put at, attracting new businesses come in. We're still looking for big successes, right? Then when you get back to some of the socioeconomic issues that, we kind of touched on earlier, at the root of that is opportunities, right? So the more jobs we have, then the more good paying jobs we have, the better chance people have of moving away from living across the street from Crota, and living in these undesirable locations. The more opportunities people have to, for healthy food, and, less stress and all of that good stuff, different kind of stress, but anyhow, less stress. So it's an admirable initiative to try to bring new businesses into the state so that we can have economic growth, because we'll all benefit from that. The challenge, though, is how do you do that without killing people, right? And so what we can't continue to do is bring in dirty, polluting industries, or industries that aren't going to operate ethically. And we get into this trade-off of jobs for the health and well-being of the people that live near those facilities. And that's not a fair trade-off in any form.
Yeah.
So when we look at the state government and county governments and county policies, we really have to concern ourselves with, how do we pursue this whole thing around economic growth and development in the state? And how do we do that in a way that's ethical? And we don't, as I say, we don't harm people. So it's that simple, but difficult.
Although one would think banks might pollute a little less than poultry farms.
Yeah, that's true.
Just saying.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, now, but never mind. I'll get off I won't even get on my soapbox about it. That's okay.
The only pushback I was going to give you, Sue, was that, that's if the bank doesn't have a gas-powered backup generator, or they're not firing a boiler to heat the building with nat gas, right? Because then you get PM 2.5, and carbon monoxide emissions and all those happy things.
All right, we'll just have everybody work from home. It'll be
actually one of the biggest polluters in downtown Wilmington is the Hotel DuPont.
Really?
That complex there. So they've got a bunch of old 1940 vintage boilers in there that burn that gas with low efficiency burners, and emissions are atrocious for those kind of things. So
we need to start to wrap up, but Sheridan, you have your hand up. You had another comment or question? Oh, you're muted.
I'm just wondering it's the elephant in the room, right? When you talk about the balance between economic growth and having healthy citizens. But I could see us trying to get a monitoring station close to the Purdue, and they'll call Carney in a second, and that monitor is not going to go in. They'll just threaten to pull out, and we lose all those jobs. And it's stressful because we kind of know what's going to happen, and it's a reason. It's a real good reason why they're not where they're supposed to be, right? So do we start this campaign to write and pressure, or do we do something else that will get us the kinds of results we want, or some of the results we want? We have to really think about that, because this is a small state.
Yeah.
One phone call to the governor, and that monitor is not going where we need it to go.
That's a challenge. And again, another perspective of what I call from the other side of the fence line, given my history. If Purdue or Mount Air has a few $100 million invested in that facility or those facilities, and because a monitor is going to be put in, they may have to invest another $1 million or $500,000. That's not a good analysis that says we need to pull up stakes and move. Okay, so at the end of the day, they're not going to move. Now, if you put enough pressure on them, from various points over time, they may become disinterested and stop investing in that facility and invest somewhere else. But it's a huge decision to shut down a multi-million-dollar facility and pick it up and move it, lose the resources, lose the people, and the capital that it takes to do that. So I don't see that as a kind of an imminent threat. But
And I had
it can create tension and friction. And to your point that, somebody at Purdue picking up the phone and calling Carney and saying, hey, get that monitor out of my backyard, that could very well happen.
I have one more question, Sue, and that is about electric vehicles. It's all the new rage, and I'm curious about those batteries. What do we do with them? How do we get rid of them? Will they contribute to more environmental issues? I don't know enough about them, so I thought maybe you can help me understand that. And that's my questions.
Yeah, that's a whole topic, right? So the one thing about electric vehicle batteries, once they reach about 40% capacity, they're no longer useful in the car. But they still have 40% capacity. And that capacity can be used as backup power for computer systems, backup power for your home. And it's still rechargeable. They just don't charge up to the full 100% capacity they used to have. So there's still uses for them even after they've been depleted. I won't say depleted or used in a car. The other issue, though, to your point, is that once they're fully depleted or no longer usable, how do you get rid of them? And so there's been some effort to try to recycle them, dismantle them. They're a bunch of little cells, just like the cells that, you would think about for a battery, the AA, AAA battery, all packaged together. So there's a lot of work going on to try to disassemble the battery, mine the rare earth minerals from it, the lithium and all of that good stuff, and kind of reuse it or reconstitute some of that. But that's kind of a short answer. There's work going on to try to deal with that, but there aren't total solutions yet.
Roger?
I was just going to echo what Willie said. There is a whole industry that's being born
Yeah,
to handle the batteries. Huge investments are being made because there are some investors and capital that realize that this is something that needs to be done, and it's an area of new competition.
right.
So I think it will take care of itself. I just hope it's done ethically and environmentally safe.
Because the materials in the batteries are so valuable.
Right. And I
Well,
think
I'd like to say thank you again, Willie, for being here this evening. It has been very enlightening. And it certainly is something that affects us to varying degrees, depending on where we are. But as we look at our responsibility to act for the common good, and particularly to speak for those whose voices are often not heard, it's important to understand the issues at hand, and the work that needs to be done is being done, the ways that we can support it, and additional steps that can be taken to make progress. So thank you so much for being here.
my pleasure.
Please give my regard to Alma.
Will do.
And I want to thank all of you for being here this evening, and to let you know that our program next week will be in person for those in the Wilmington area. In recognition of Black History Month, we will be promoting or encouraging your attendance at an event at the Wilmington Public Library. It's at 6 o'clock, not 7 o'clock, next Thursday evening. And it features an amazing author, Jessamine Ward. She is the only woman and the second African-American to win 2 National Book Awards for her writing. And she will be kicking off a collaborative program between the Wilmington Library and the University of Delaware, Still I Rise, Black History Month speaker series. If you think you might want to attend, you are encouraged to come a little bit early because these events fill up quickly. But 6 o'clock at the Wilmington Library at Rodney Square. next week. We hope to see you there.
And before we go, I'd like to add my thanks to Willie and say that I am grateful for the work that DEAC is doing.
Thanks, appreciate that. Then if there are any questions or thoughts after the fact, Sally has my email address. Feel free to shoot me a note.
Wonderful. Thank
very
you
good.
all.
Thanks for
Thank
the
you for being
opportunity.
here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Mhm.